So today the presentation that I'm giving has quite a lot of theory in it, but it does have some empirical work that I'm going to use as a bit of an illustration, and also an example of a sort of practitioner-based program right at the end. So I haven't timed it, but I'm hoping it's about 40 minutes. And I've tried to make it relevant to a sort of broader audience, even though I guess the focus, because of my work, is really on health and health promotion, so I'm situating the theory in that context. So faced with complex problems such as obesity, climate change and overconsumption, I've got to touch the screen. The majority of approaches for programs and policies turn to lifestyles or behaviour change as one of, or sometimes the only form of intervention. And in health, although there have been a few successes through health promotion, efforts to date can be said to be generally mixed, while the problems are more pressing than ever. And in looking to understand why health promotion has been criticised for supporting neoliberal the 3 points that are usually made are that it supports neoliberal agendas, it usually treats structure and agency separately in the design of programs and interventions, and the emphasis and responsibilities placed squarely on the shoulders of individuals. So as a brief introduction to health promotion for those people that are not that familiar with it, it's been described as the process of enabling people to increase control over and improve their health, and it moves beyond a focus on individual behaviour towards a wide range of social and environmental conditions. So health promotion puts health on the agenda of policymakers in all sectors and at all levels, so not just the health sector. In essence, it aims to work at a number of levels to improve the living, working conditions of people, as well as change individual behaviour. And by way of background, or maybe to refresh your memories, it was in 1986 that the first conference on health promotion was held in Ottawa in Canada, amid calls for a new public health movement. And as a call to arms, the Ottawa Charter was an agreement created and endorsed by delegates and included, among other aims, the goal of creating health for all by the year 2000 through better health promotion. And a number of actions were listed, as well as recognition of a number of prerequisites of health. So in other words, there was formal recognition of the social and environmental conditions for health. So there are largely two main approaches in health promotion, and these are targeting policies and programs to create health through improving social, economic and environmental conditions, and then strengthening the skills of individuals, which is usually through behaviour change. So this conceptualisation aims to get at and solve health problems from opposite ends, but it usually treats structural or behavioural and agentic approaches independently. And the same binaries can be said to exist in sustainability research and policy, and also probably many other policy domains. And perpetuating this binary or treating these strategies independently can overlook how structure and agency are entangled together in everyday life, where health is created and experienced through daily routines. And obviously the Ottawa Charter, which aimed to achieve health for all by the year 2000, has not been achieved. But rather than giving up, Fran Baum has suggested that the health promotion movement has the possibility of reinventing itself in the 21st century. And part of the problem identified by Froelich et al. In 2001 is that in most traditional health research, behaviours are studied independently of the social context, in isolation from other individuals, and as practices devoid of social meaning. So with these encouragements, this presentation aims to reconsider how health outcomes for individuals and populations can be better understood and interpreted by drawing on theories of social practice. So in doing so, it delves into contemporary theories of social practice, generally coming from consumption and sustainability research, to provide an alternative and more contextualised means of understanding and explaining human action in relation to health and well-being. And although the focus is on health, I'll try and make, there are some connections with education, and I'll try and make these points where possible. So I had some guiding questions, and these have been informing my thinking over the last couple of years. So they are, I guess I'll just read them out. What new ways of thinking about and understanding health might assist health promotion in achieving health for all? How can we better address the socio-technical or socio-material dimensions of how health is lived and experienced every day? what are social practices and how could they provide a different way of understanding health? And in responding to Baum, what might new socio-technical or socio-material directions for health promotion look like? I don't necessarily have all the answers for these yet. So as an alternative to focusing on either structure or agency in behaviour, theories of social practice have gained a lot of ground in sustainability and consumption research to understand the complexity of daily routines and the implications for sustainability, which has faced similar challenges to health promotion and probably education in moving beyond individuals. And these here are just some of the, two books that involve Shove and one that involves me in the middle. And in particular, social practice theories incorporate the role of technologies, materials and things in daily life, focusing on socio-technical relations rather than those that are just social or behavioural in nature only. So this work is now being applied and it's making its way into cutting-edge environmental policy in the UK and in Australia as a way of moving on from behaviour change and towards a more situated means of conceptualising and creating social and environmental change. So what is a social practice? There are actually various definitions in the literature. This one by Reckwitz is relatively popular in that practices are routinized actions involving interconnected elements of bodily knowledge and bodily and mental activities, objects, materials, and socially shared competencies, knowledge, and skills. But Shove et al. Have usefully distilled this, I guess, into these three elements to describe practices as being composed of these three things. So we have meanings, materials, and skills, and I'll explain what they are in a minute. So often illustrated by this diagram of three circles. There's many practices that make up daily routines. So it really depends on what your empirical interest is, but practices such as commuting, working, exercising, washing, learning, cleaning, caring and socialising could all be examples of practice. And each would be constituted by these three elements, the materials, meanings and skills. And together they make up the practice. So if one or other of those elements is missing, the practice is unable to be carried out or performed. So I've got the practice of eating breakfast here, where we have meanings of what to eat for breakfast, when, with whom, where and why. Skills relating to how to source, shop for, store, prepare, cook and eat breakfast foods and drinks, cleaning up, treatment of waste. And the particular materials and infrastructures involved, so the food itself, the beverages, condiments, shops, recipes, kitchens, appliances, the list could almost be endless. It really depends on your focus. But each practice, whether it's eating breakfast, running outdoors or showering, must be performed habitually by multiple practitioners. If it's only performed by one person, then it's technically not a practice. So as another example, we have here the practice of running outdoors, where there are certain materials that are required to perform this practice, as well as certain running skill or competence, and lastly a reason to run, or the meanings of running. This is only part of the story though, which I'll pick up on in a minute. So I essentially want to make 4 points about social practices that distinguish them from other theories and behavioural approaches to describe human action. The first is that the latest applications take a post-humanist stance. They recognise the role of technologies, materials and things in the construction of everyday life. So in studying water consumption in homes, for example, we study the practice of showering. So showering involves shower heads, bathrooms, towels, certain skills and competencies, meanings of when and how many showers to have, as well as the water that's actually consumed in the practice of showering. So the focus is very much on these socio-technical relations or socio-material relations rather than just social ones. And normally considered as external factors or context, social practice theory elevates materials, objects and infrastructures and part of the natural world possibly to the status of active elements or agents that co-constitute practices. So secondly, social practices are recognised as discrete entities in their own right. So they have pasts, presents and futures. They have a trajectory. And descriptions of the practice entity, so those 3 circles, or elements of meanings, materials and skills, are actually distinguished from their moments of enactment and performance, which are carried out by people or carriers, often referred to as performers of practices. So as a way of explaining this distinction, I guess, some of you are probably all familiar with the health iceberg, where invisibility of the social determinants of health are revealed as beneath the surface of the tip of the iceberg, which represents the observable behaviour, what we can see, what people are doing. We don't always see all of this stuff underneath. Well, similarly, there is also the practice iceberg, which explains the distinction between the performance and the entity. So practices, or you might want to think of them as behaviours for the moment, are the visible bit at the tip, what we can see, and all the elements that make up the practice are submerged beneath the waterline where we generally can't see them. So it's important to note this differentiation between practice entities and the performance. So thinking back to the practice of eating breakfast, when it's performed, we can only observe the actions involved in the moment of performance. We wouldn't necessarily see or understand the meanings, the shopping and the food preparation that would have gone into it, or necessarily take notice of the tables, kitchen, etc., and all the other material elements that are involved. So the third point is that practices interact with other practices to form practice bundles and complexes. So bundles are looser groups of practices that might be co-located either in space or time, but they're not necessarily codependent. And complexes are integrated, codependent arrangements of practice that have a certain sequence and synchronisation. This is not necessarily the best diagram, but that's what I've come up with for now. And I'd probably refer you to Chauvidal's book for further explanation of these terms. So the practice of eating breakfast, for example, intersects with and is often dependent on other practices that happen as part of a morning routine. So that might include caring for others, getting dressed, exercising, any number of other activities. But it emphasises the relations between practices. Practices don't often exist in isolation. They are always intersecting and interconnected with other practices in some way. So the fourth point is that social practice theories collapse the divide between structure and agency. So they're not external factors or context. So agency can be found in individual elements, it can be found in entire practices and practice bundles and complexes. And structure results from the performance of multiple practices, practice bundles and complexes over time and space. That's because it's through the repeated performance of practice entities that creates the observable structural features of the social. So agency and structure are co-constitutive. Structures are not seen to be bearing down on practices or being external to practices. They're incorporated in the practice and result from the performance of practices. So these four features of social practice, theories of social practice, decentre individual humans and move away from looking for linear or causal relationships for what people do, explaining them by attitudes, behaviours and choices. And there's a very good article by Elizabeth Shove on that from 2010. So in our research, we still, of course, study people, but the unit of analysis becomes the practice rather than individual performers. So what does all this mean? Well, applying the latest thinking in social practice theory to health and probably education research and related fields means that health and well-being are considered outcomes of participating in a set of social practices, mutually constructed by the materiality of everyday life and not the result of individual behaviours or external factors or context. And although it's tempting to label or translate healthy and unhealthy behaviours as healthy and unhealthy social practices, it's not actually easy to do because some behaviours such as smoking or drinking would not necessarily qualify as practices in their own right because they might be the small observable tip or part of a wider practice such as going out with friends, seeing a band or other types of socialising. Not everybody agrees with this conceptualisation. There is a paper by Blue et al. That talks about smoking as a social practice, but I tend to think that there's something broader going on than just the smoking itself. And further, classifying practices as unhealthy or healthy, as currently understood, would potentially exclude some practices that have quite significant health outcomes, such as driving to work every day, which has recently been labelled the new smoking. It also perpetuates existing binaries of good and bad, which are often overly simplistic and cut out a lot of the complexity and the diversity experienced in everyday life. Instead, ideas of healthy and unhealthy could be conceptualised as meanings within a practice or practices. There is also the point that Some practices labelled risky or potentially unhealthy might simply be unavoidable, like sitting at a desk all day. In essence, every practice could be said to have both positive and negative health outcomes, and it's the sum total of participation in a particular set of practices that will result in the observed health status of individual people or groups. So moving away from the theory a little bit, I was going to try and illustrate some of these ideas by talking about some research I've been doing on a master planned housing estate designed to improve health and wellbeing. So I don't know if you have that term over here, but basically a master planned housing estate is a brand new estate that is usually built where there was fields or paddocks, and the whole thing has to be constructed from scratch. And it's a very common form of new housing in Australia, and is generally detached private dwellings, not usually any other or much housing diversity. So Salandra Rise is a community I've been studying for the last 5 years, and it's an 1,800 lot development in Melbourne's Southeast Growth Corridor, and it's a demonstration project being built by a land developer with a number of other partners, including the local council, state government, and a national planning body. So the aim of the research was, to what extent do best practice planning principles for space and place impact on the health and wellbeing of residents of Salandra Rise? So there's a number of key features that have gone into the design, including community gardens and a focus on food sustainability. There's the early delivery of a community development centre and a community development officer, almost from day one. There's an emphasis on walkability and multi-use parks, as well as an outdoor gym, and a range of programs run through the community centre that foster healthy eating and physical activity. So this is roughly where it is. This is a bit of a poor map. So we have Australia up the top, Victoria, where the A is on that smaller picture, and then this is sort of broadly Melbourne. The city is in the centre here, and Salandra Rise is where that A is over there. So that's Port Phillip Bay in the middle. So it's actually located 55 kilometres from the city, and I've been using a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, and we've been collecting data before residents moved in, as well as following their lives as they've moved in and settled into Salandra Rise to look at change over time. We've been doing in-depth interviews focusing on their daily routines, their neighbourhood experience and expectations, as well as an annual survey to measure the impact of key design features on residents' health and wellbeing. And yes, we've done interviews at multiple time points. And I guess I wanted to just confess that I haven't used social practice theory from the beginning of this project, because it was really determined as I took it on. But I've been using theories of social practice to understand the outcomes and what I've observed in the project. So this is not terribly informative, I guess, but I just wanted to show that it roughly is a rectangle. It has a grid layout, and there's a number of different features with shops coming in at the top. There's a retirement village in the top right-hand corner, primary school, secondary school, and a number of parks and ovals, and the community centre is that blue, part of that blue bit in the middle. So the shops weren't complete while we were doing the research. There was a retirement village and the secondary school, and the parks were open, as well as the community centre, but there was no primary school or childcare at the time of the research. So our participants were mainly young couples under 40 years of age buying their first home. Education levels varied, and they all worked full-time in a range of employment sectors. They were really culturally diverse, so we had about just over half reporting being born in Australia, and the remainder were born overseas, largely India, Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. They were generally more highly educated and earned higher incomes than the surrounding local government area, which is generally quite considered quite a rough, low socioeconomic area. So the main planned activities to encourage physical activity were walkability and what they called an active design. So all houses were within 300 metres of the parks. There's 1.5 metre footpaths. There was 2 kilometres of bike paths, which is really not very long if you're cycling. The parks were designed to be diverse, so Hilltop Park had an outdoor gym, and Heritage Park had a dog park, and there was a youth park also to come. A couple of basketball courts. Salandra Community Place was the community centre where they ran group physical activity classes, and they actually managed to get early delivery of a bus service which opened mid last year. So with all of these amazing initiatives, the question begs, were residents exercising more? That was one of the questions we were looking at. So I'm just focusing on that today. So this graph shows the self-reported changes in physical activity since residents moved to Salandra Rise. And it's not just physical activity that they were doing at Salandra Rise, it was all of their physical activity. So it includes off-site activity. And it appears to have had a positive effect, with some people reporting that they increased, or 25% reporting they increased a little, and 17% saying they increased their activity a lot. However, most of them responded that it didn't change or decreased. And when we looked into the interviews, we found out why residents were saying that. Sorry, this is a bit of a heavy slide, but I'm going to go through these points. So looking at the interview data, there were three main challenges to outdoor exercise carried out on site at Salandra Rise. Firstly, the seasons or the weather was mentioned. And it was the outdoor nature of the exercise they were trying to encourage was significantly hindered in winter as well as summer, with residents reporting the lack of shade, shelter, lights at night as deterrents to doing exercise outdoors. And the weather was mentioned by nearly everybody. This was from, I think, 46 interviews, and some of these people we'd interviewed 2 or 3 times. And the fitness stations in the park as part of the outdoor gym were particularly mentioned as being exposed and not having lights or shelter. So Deborah said in 2013, in winter it's a lot harder because by the time you get home from work it's 7 and it's dark and there's no lighting there. So in summer you get home, it's still light, so you can go for a walk or a run. So secondly, there was also the issue of the lack of time and the commute challenge. So Kale in 2015 said, I haven't been able to find the formula again, how to get exercise in my life while studying and commuting that long trip. And then thirdly, there was the problem of the lack of connectivity of paths and tracks. So Stephanie said, I've got a bike, I haven't done any riding because there's nowhere far enough to ride. Like if I was going to ride, I'd ride the big block down to Narrewarren Cranbourne Road and back in this way, but there's no path. And actually what she's describing is the estate is essentially surrounded by quite narrow but incredibly fast roads of 100 kilometres an hour, so they're incredibly dangerous. There's no footpaths or anything on either side. So in what follows, I'm just going to focus on the first 2 of those issues raised. So using social practice theory, we can analyse the role that some of these neighbourhood materials have played in co-constituting residents' outdoor exercise practices, including the way the neighbourhood's actually experienced by residents through sensory, spatial and temporal relations. So for example, the outdoor gym with the fitness stations has been provided with the aim of increasing residents' physical activity, and there's some use of the gym, but it's really limited because there's a mismatch between the elements required for gym-based exercise. So the interview data tells us that the lack of lights at night, no drinking fountain and the lack of shelter were materials residents said influenced why they didn't use the outdoor gym. And despite a sign discouraging them, children were actually using the gym as play equipment because there was a lack of play equipment and things to do for sort of middle year, primary age school children. So the equipment was being used in unintended ways or had different meanings to the people who designed and installed it. In addition, there were meanings of comfort and convenience associated with indoor gyms that the outdoor equipment just couldn't compete with, as illustrated by that quote from Lance. So on moving to Salandra Rise though, the journey to work was longer for most participants, meaning they had less time to exercise, and in winter there was less light to exercise outdoors when they returned home. And that's the point I'm going to go into a little bit further. So this is a bit of a crude map, but its main point is to illustrate, so this is Melbourne CBD up the top, that's where Salandra Rise is, and this is people's work postcodes. So as you can see, a lot of them, actually 25%, were working in the city. So they were commuting that distance, 110 kilometres there and back every day in peak hour traffic. So thinking about competition and other practices and the lack of time, as you can see, few of them are actually working locally. And the travel time to work, to and from work, is the biggest challenge every day, as our survey participants said. So just a few points around that. So when looking at car ownership, we found that households often got a second car when they moved to Salandra Rise, with 2-car households jumping from 61% in the households before, when they were living in their before neighbourhoods, and then to nearly 80% when they were living in Salandra Rise. And the number of 1-car households actually dropped. So prospective Saloundra Rise residents often didn't anticipate how long their commute would be, the limitations to public transport and the difficulty of finding local employment close to home. So over 1/3 were commuting more than an hour each way, and some of them were regularly commuting 90 minutes each way. Very few found work closer to home when they moved, despite looking. And we recognise that although the provision of local employment opportunities is recommended, and that was also one of the aims of the demonstration project, it's incredibly difficult to achieve in practice. So in the survey, we asked respondents about their change in the amount of exercise they did, which I had a slide up on that before, and we explored this in relation to their commute time, where we had short, medium and long commutes. So short was less than 30 minutes, and long was 60 or more minutes, and medium was in the middle. And we found that long travellers more often reported a decrease in their exercise after moving to Saloundra Rise compared to short travellers and medium travellers. Similarly, we looked at weight gain and we found a similar result. So 92 participants completed the survey at more than one time point and self-reported their weight each time, which I know is not a perfect way of measuring weight. And over half of the long travellers gained weight compared to just over a quarter of the short travellers. And there was also a weak but highly significant correlation between long travel and kilograms gained over the course of the study. So many residents of new communities, not just Saloundra Rise, many living in these growth corridors have long and unpredictable commutes. And there's a range of evidence now to show that these long commutes are very detrimental to health. So in the US, long commutes have been linked with reduced time spent exercising, preparing food and sleeping, and decreased fitness, high blood pressure, blood sugar and cholesterol. And there's also evidence for weight gain and obesity. So in outer areas, many residents' commutes are much longer than average, with 1 in 4 Australians now commuting more than 1 hour each way. And this has been steadily increasing as our cities grow larger. So what this example from Saloundra Rise shows is that the lack of materials and infrastructure supporting local jobs and shops meant that a lot of time is required to perform the practice of working due to long commutes, which competes for and absorbs time that could be used for the other practices that the designers of Saloundra Rise are trying to encourage, such as exercising or growing food or walking to the local shops to buy food. So admittedly, some of these problems are due to the delay in the construction of the shops, and their resolution is partly beyond the scope and the reach of the partners. But it highlights this point that practices don't exist in isolation. They're materially interwoven with some practices and they're in direct competition with others. So empirically, this implies that studying one practice in isolation from the others with which it intersects or competes is likely to be limited in its power to explain a current issue or social problem, as well as providing a limited basis on which to design intervention and change. So this is just a word cloud from some of the open responses from the survey that shows that public transport and shops were two of the main things that they mentioned. So in general, the reasons why practices aren't performed or don't persist over time might be that there is a missing element or the links between the practice elements are damaged or broken. There might be a lack of routine performance for other reasons, such as shifting meanings or a changing relationship to other dependent practices or elements. And as we've seen, there's competition from other practices. There's only so much time available in the day, and time is a resource that practices need in order to be performed. Oops. So taking these ideas forward and responding to Baum, there is potential opportunity to reframe some existing health promotion programs and policy to target social practices instead of behaviours or lifestyles. And by this I'm implying that we don't necessarily have to throw everything out and start again, but it's about thinking about them differently. So this would involve thinking about the elements, materials, meanings and skills, and how to provide new combinations of elements, or replacing elements in existing practices, as well as encouraging the spread of new practices. It's also recognising the relationships between practices, bundles and complexes through mechanisms like competition, cooperation and symbiosis, among others. And I really like Chauvin Pansar's work in that regard. And also looking at intersecting practices which together form a bundle or a complex. They're also likely to all need intervention, not just single practices. And then there are the spatial and temporal demands of practices that also need to be accounted for. So in that vein, I guess, I've well, and if you look at some health promotion programs, some of them could be said to emanate a social practices approach. So the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden program is one that I've picked out. And Stephanie Alexander, if you probably don't know, which is quite a famous Australian chef, not quite as famous as maybe Jamie Oliver, but similar philosophy. And in 2008, the Australian government committed $12.8 million to fund the rollout of the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Garden program to build gardens and kitchen infrastructure in 177 government primary schools across Australia, because it was recognised that primary schools provide an ideal location to engage children in behaviours or practices that will support their health for life. So the focus of the program was to enable these students in primary school, years 3 to 6, to learn how to grow, harvest, prepare and share seasonal fresh food in the belief that this approach would positively influence their food choices, or we would reframe that as practices. So the children spend a minimum of 45 minutes each week in the vegetable garden that they've actually helped design, build and maintain. And the garden is on the school grounds and run according to organic gardening principles. The children then also spend 90 minutes each week in a kitchen classroom preparing and sharing meals that are produced from the foods that they've grown in the garden. And the school employs, with the funding, 2 part-time specialist staff, a gardener and a cook to run these sessions. So the program is actually implemented with a whole school approach and engages the local community, and it's integrated with the school curriculum as well. There's been a number of evaluations, but the one I was drawing on was by Yeatman et al. From the University of Wollongong in New South Wales. And they did student and parent surveys, which contributed to quantitatively assessing 4 lifestyle domains: garden lifestyle behaviours, kitchen lifestyle behaviours, eating habits and food choices. I think this could be more usefully reframed as studying or intervening in the linked practices or bundle or complex of gardening, cooking and eating. So through recruitment to these new interlinked practices and practice elements, the students developed kitchen and cooking skills. They learned how to use different materials, including using equipment and reading recipes. They also learnt meanings relating to cooking, eating and sharing food. And the practice approach actually emphasised the interlinked nature of these practices and the need for a coordinated intervention, which Stephanie Alexander designed in her program, the time demands and the materiality of different humans and non-humans involved. So we're almost there. So to conclude, I've suggested in this presentation that social practice theory could be used to reinvigorate or reinvent health promotion, and together these 2 approaches could help us better understand health and well-being. Theories of social practice mesh quite well with health promotion because it already acknowledges both structure and agency. It looks beyond health to all policy sectors, and it connects with ideas of working upstream instead of downstream at the illness end. In particular though, social practice theory could help health promotion collapse or move away from the structure-agency binary which it's suffered from and move beyond an individual focus. It would help incorporate the role of materiality in technology and non-humans in daily life, and account further for the complexity of everyday life, considering other aspects of daily routines other than what's labelled healthy or unhealthy behaviours. And ultimately, perhaps it could help us get better to achieving the aims of the Ottawa Charter. Thank you.